Best-selling author Amy Tan says 10 years ago she was so overwhelmed with despair at the state of the world, she turned to the natural beauty in her own backyard, specifically birds, in search of hope. The Backyard Bird Chronicles is a beautiful collection of sketches and reflections on that personal journey. Along the way, she says she developed a stronger emotional connection to people and to birds. Amy joins me to talk about her writing, complicated family relationships, and, of course, birds. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. This is Birds and Nerds. Thank you so much for joining me on the Birds and Nerds podcast.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
The premise of Birds and Nerds really is to talk about a subject that I want to know more about, and I think the audience wants to know more about. And then, of course, we have to get to the birds. That is key to all of these podcasts. So I really would love to talk to you about your creative journey for a few minutes. Like, what sparked you to want to write? I always, as I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, I want to know what sparked you.
Despair, actually. I was a freelance business writer back in the 80s, and I was quite good at it. I had a lot of clients, 12 projects at a time, billable hours, making a lot of money, and I was absolutely miserable because the writing I was doing was meaningless. It was largely about account management and telecommunications, and these were not subjects that were life-changing for me. So I'd wake up, I'd have this clients who loved me, a lot of work, and I would just think, is this all I'm going to be doing the rest of my life? I decided to read fiction. And once I started doing that, I fell in love with writing. I wanted to write my own stories. So that's what I did. Well, I discovered that is a way to find meaning in my life, because here I was going into this unknown area and working it out, and these surprising revelations would happen. And they were a lot about the truth of my life, the way that it really felt when I was a child, but with the adult understanding of what went on, and how it has transformed over time into a different understanding. And that was so rewarding. I knew that I would do that the rest of my life, regardless whether I made money doing that. I could always still do the freelance business writing.
I have a similar kind of thought in my own life. I always wanted to be a writer. And that was when I was younger. And I grew up in a lower middle class family in the Midwest. And nobody in my family even thought about being, on a creative journey or storytelling journey. And I still remember, and I love my parents, but they had no, I want to say imagination when it came to careers,
No, they were just practical.
They were very deeply practical.
Yeah, I was supposed to be a doctor.
Yeah. And my dad said to me, and this is in the day, he said, you should be a secretary. And he said, yeah. And I said, I want to be something else. And I don't know how to get there. But I always remember he said, you should take typing. I said, I don't want to type. And all I do now is type. Which I learned to do the touch typing. But I became a journalist when I was 20. I wrote my first news in Chicago when I was 20. But I also wanted to have that kind of created expression. So I packed everything up, moved to LA, and wrote sitcoms for a while, and then got back into business and news and that. And so this is my creative outlet. But I say this because you can be a storyteller, and I think there are great storytellers in the business world. But sometimes you're not telling your story; you're telling someone else's.
Yeah. Fiction is often a way to tell your own story.
Yes.
And you have the subterfuge of characters who then can fool you into revealing things you normally wouldn't reveal, and not even to a psychiatrist, I think. And it just comes out naturally, unforced. At least that's how it happened with me. And I don't do writing for therapy, but I do have these experiences that are very, very important to me and revelatory about who I am.
So you write a lot about, in the past, and I've read a lot of it, your mom, your relationship with your mother, which I've heard you describe as difficult. How did that kind of manifest itself into nonfiction? I mean, what was that like to take that, even though you said it's not all autobiographical, but how do you take that and translate it into words?
Into nonfiction. My nonfiction always has to do with a personal perspective. So I wouldn't be writing about, say, dogs in general, an informational article. It would be about my particular experiences with dogs. And I mention the dogs because somebody just from the New York Times just interviewed me about dogs in a piece that I wrote about dogs. But the fiction, I will have to say what I find very interesting in how people describe what I write. They use subjects. And so I don't think of myself as writing about subjects. It's usually writing about emotions.
Mhm.
And yes, my mother has a lot to do with the emotions that I have embedded within me and those past experiences. But emphasis, I am not writing about mothers and daughters. I'm writing about me, and it happens to be not me. It happens to be stories about what I believe or how things happen, about humanity, who we are as human beings, my own particular identity. But of course, family has a lot to do with how that was shaped. So, big emphasis there. I'm not writing about the subject of immigrants or mothers and daughters. That just happens to be part of my identity.
When you wrote Joy Luck Club, I believe your mother was still alive. Oh, yes, I did read that she was. And how did she see? I know you're not writing about the relationship, you're writing about yourself. But did she see herself in that? And what was the kind of reaction?
Yeah. Um, you know, uh, I should say, yes, I'm not writing about mothers and daughters. I'm writing about something that has to do with a particular mother and a particular daughter. That clarification is needed, as opposed to a topic. Um, my mother read that book before it was published. I gave her a galley copy. And when she finished it, she said, so easy to read. She was a little bit upset later that people thought that everything was true because she thought people did not give me enough credit for having an imagination. And she knew I had a very big imagination. And so, even though this story was not necessarily identical to who she was or what she had been through, she knew that on the basis of what I had written, that I had listened to her stories, that I had listened to her advice, that I knew her concerns and worries, and that was all captured there. And thereafter, instead of spending hours trying to get me to understand something, she said, "Oh, I don't have to tell you, you're just like me." So that was great. But then she wanted me to write her true story. So she absolutely trusted me to write something. It didn't require me to hide the unpleasant parts. I could talk about the fact that she nearly killed me once, and she wasn't bothered by that. She was into truth, and I think she shaped my insistence on finding truth in a way that, fiction is not about lies. It's contriving a situation that ultimately reveals the truth about human nature, human being, or myself. Um, so yeah, her only disagreement with people who praise the book is that a lot of people just thought it was dictation, autobiography, and it certainly wasn't that. Yeah, yeah.
I
So
love that. I love that she supported you in
yeah,
in that way emotionally, that
yeah,
give her the
yeah,
credit that she deserves,
yeah.
being able to tell a good
Which
story.
that, and also it was the good and the bad. Her worries, my reaction to it, my refusal to look at the world the same way. and that was all there, and she could see that what I went through and what I understood. And at the end of her life, when she had Alzheimer's, and she came through at one point with such surprising clarity, she actually apologized to me for all the ways that she had hurt me. And that was such a gift to me. And I think that she did that because she understood what I remembered and what I knew and what I appreciated, and that I truly loved her, despite all the terrible things we went through together.
And I'm going to say, I don't know if I'm going to keep this part in, but I will share this with you. Maybe I will then. I found out after both my parents had passed away that my biological father was someone different. And they were both gone. And so I did not have that closure with my parents, and my relationship with them was not as strained as I think yours sounds. But I was able to, I have not figured out that, and I know you say you don't write for therapy, but I'm thinking about trying to figure out how to tell that story, to find out in my 60s, a parent was not the parent I expected. It's no one to ask. It's so crazy.
Yeah. I think that it can have the same effects as going through therapy. I think of therapy as being a kind of more a different form, and that I don't follow that form of talking to a person and then having them ask me questions and then writing to that, getting only to the, a therapist looks at particular things about you. This is different. And sometimes my writing doesn't leave me with closure. It leaves me with wounds. It leaves me more disturbed. And that's fine. I can then take whatever it was that came up and deal with that emotion in another story and explore it a little bit more, why I feel that way. And sometimes, I come up with kind of bad things, conclusions in life. You're supposed to come away with a story and say, well, now I see the hidden joy in losing your family in an avalanche. No, some of that is, I don't have that kind of pablum in my fiction. I mean, there's always a sense of emotional understanding at the end of the story. But I mean, one of them that I came up with at the end of writing a story is that no, I don't have to forgive certain people who have really hurt me and who have nothing to offer, because forgiveness implies you want to continue the relationship, and I don't. And it doesn't keep that wound in me. I forget about them, but I don't have to forgive them and say, let's begin anew, because maybe they were never the people I should have had in my life. And they're usually not really important relationships like my husband or something. It could be like a friend who then I realize have been using me all this time. And
I think that's a really important thing to learn, because when you're young, I mean, I grew up in the feeling that, friends, or family, I needed to really keep close, right? Just say, oh, yeah, that's who they are, and just accept it. But as I got older too, I kind of said, I can shed that person.
You get older and you realize there's less time to spend with people.
It's healthier.
Why spend it?
Much healthier. And I also read that, and maybe I should just ask it this way: what made you start journaling for the Backyard Bird Chronicle? What was
same answer? Despair. I think despair is a very useful tool in our lives, unless you just sit in despair and do nothing about it, because despair really leaves out hope. It leaves out your ability to do anything creative, for one thing. And it just makes everything tinted with this gloominess. So I was very gloomy in 2016. it had to do with the election in a sense, but what it was even before the election. It was the tenor of our country. It was the divisiveness, and it was the increase in racism, which also was directed at me. And not just simply the old to go back to where you came from stuff, which I'd always gotten, which, by the way, that would be Oakland, California, is where I was born. But it was the negatives that were also articulated by people in general throughout the country. It shocked me. And it was so ugly. It felt so personal that I had to get out of my head. And I decided I'd go back into nature and I would do something I had been wanting to do since I was 5 years old. And that is to draw, to take lessons in drawing and learn how to draw. So that was the beginning.
So it was like an escape from just, kind of, I don't want to say reality, because I'm sure you still stay in reality, but it was escape from those negative feelings, it sounds like, which is
it was not really just an escape. It was to find hope again. And so, escape is you shut it out, you don't think about it, the world is burned up, and then you come back and the world's still burned up. But it was more restorative, but to find the strength to move forward and to have hope again, and to see that there were good things that could happen still. And I needed that, because I wouldn't have been able to write. I couldn't write. As a matter of fact, everything seemed trivial, irrelevant to what was going on. And I needed to find relevance without despair. So despair is a conclusion, and hope is wide. It's endless possibilities, and that's what I needed. You need to have endless possibilities in writing fiction. You can't start with a conclusion.
Have you always had an affinity for nature, or has it been a part of your life, or was it a new experience to suddenly turn to look in your own backyard?
I have I would say I've had an affinity to nature since I was a kid, but I wasn't exposed that much to be in the great outdoors. We were a family in which my mother and father had to work. My father worked 7 days a week. We didn't have chances to go on vacation, for example. There was no summer camp, but there was summer school. So there were 2 vacations we went in my entire childhood, and that was to Disneyland and Marine World. So concrete jungle kind of activities. But there were occasional times we would go to a lake for a church activity, for example. And I was just overjoyed. And I would play in the water and I would find snakes, spiders, and salamanders and lizards. And that was a big joy. One year we moved next to a creek about a block away. The creek was close by. And that's where I spent my days looking at tadpoles and catching lizards. And snakes were a big thing of mine. I used to try to catch garter snakes and would let them, wrap themselves around me. And so as a result, I grew up loving creatures, and I still love snakes and spiders. But I didn't really look at birds. And I think in part it's because from the age of 6, I was very nearsighted and I didn't like to wear my glasses. So, these days I have bad vision. If you have bad vision and you looked at a tree to find a bird and you don't see anything, you're not going to be motivated to keep looking for birds. And, the only birds I noticed were those that I thought were going to attack me, because I had seen that movie, The Birds.
Yes, of course.
And the birds were, that film was filmed close to where I lived in
Laurel Bay, right?
It was in Bodega Bay.
Oh, Bodega Bay, right.
Yeah.
Oh,
so that was not far from Santa Rosa. And so when the birds, whenever I saw a big bird, and one time I swear the one tried to attack me. I was sure it was from the movie. And it probably never happened, or there was a crow that flew by, or Or maybe it was because it was close to a nest or whatever. But anyway, I thought birds were dangerous. And there are people in the world who think that.
I have a friend, Michelle, a good friend of mine, who is nervous around birds. The fluttering of it is what she tells me. And I keep telling her, what is that? Aversion therapy or immersion therapy. I said, we're just going to go somewhere where there's a lot of birds and you'll see they're not going to attack you. I promise. She is so afraid of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very unfortunate because birds are just, I keep looking over the side because I see birds coming into this porch area. I mean, you can be anywhere and never be bored because there are birds everywhere, unless you're inside a concrete building.
I grew up in the Midwest, and cardinals were in our backyard. And so beautiful. And I always loved birds, but never, I was not as passionate about them as I am now. But I realized throughout my life, I had little things that had birds on them. I've always had I had a napkin holder that had birds on it, or a little piece, a little tchotchke, or some earrings. And I was thinking, well, I never really realized that until I got older that they were there. And much like what you turn to birds for, the despair at in that time, right around COVID is when I first really just kind of paused and said, there are birds right outside my porch. I wonder what kind of bird that is. I hear it every morning. I wonder what kind of bird that is. And that's where I started getting passionate about it.
Yeah. I think we were given permission to just what would have been considered frittering away time not doing work or, socializing with people. But now you couldn't. All you could do was sit at home. And what better thing to discover you have birds out your window.
It's just oh, what a surprise.
Yeah. And spend not just the usual amount of time people do looking, oh, look, there's a cardinal. And then that.
And then going
instead, it's, oh, look, there's a cardinal. And then stare at it for about 2 hours. And then,
I love that. And when I was kind of rereading the book again, and really right at the front of the book, on your first, I think it was your first entry. And I'm just going to read it for those who haven't seen it yet. But I love this. I had gained entry into a wild animal's world. It was my own backyard with a portal big enough for the bird I imagined myself to be. That is so beautiful because I think just in those two sentences, you really capture that feeling of connecting with the bird, and explain to the people who are listening and watching what that moment was. I think it was with the hummingbird, if I remember.
Yeah. When I was first starting to look, I saw an ad somewhere. It was a video about a guy who would use a little tiny hummingbird feeder and he could get hummingbirds to come. And I thought, oh, this is a gimmick. He probably trained those hummingbirds for years, raised them from eggs and taught them how to do that. But I thought, well, this thing costs $2. Why not try? And I had a background in observing things, by the way. I was a linguist in linguistics. And I learned this, what you look for and how you can encourage certain kinds of behavior. But anyway, I put this little feeder down and I watched it come closer and closer. I moved the feeder closer and closer until it was in my hand, and immediately just came to my hand and started feeding. And I was talking to the hummingbird, and it would look up at me and then keep feeding and look up at me. It was so unafraid. And I've since found out hummingbirds are among the most fearless birds out there. But it would look up to me as I talked to it in this soft voice. You're so beautiful. Look at your feathers. I'd learned to do that as part of my drawing. And after a while, I really wanted to understand what the bird saw in me. Now, if I moved quickly, it would take off. I think it's an instinct birds have and a necessary one. But if I talked to it while being very still, that didn't bother the bird. And I've done that with other birds where they're right there. And if I absolutely still and talk in a very soft little friendly voice, they will stay. That led me to want to understand what are the instincts and also what are the learned behaviors of birds, and how can I work within that framework to be able to be more closely aligned with them in the environment and for them to feel comfortable. I had a quick understanding when I used binoculars that were 8x42, which is your normal size binoculars, and I put them up, they'd take off. Even though I was in my dining room, they can see anything. They see everything. When I got a pair of smaller binoculars and I lifted them up slowly, they didn't take off. So I'm imagining now that I'm a bird looking at something and I see these two large eyes right there. Well, that is a predator. That is something that can eat me. And it's a big predator because the eyes are really big. And that led to my thinking more and more about how birds survive, actually. I would see how they would go about looking for food. And then I would imagine myself as a bird and where I would go and what I would do and what happens in the rain. How do I feel? What are my smarts in getting things? And I was learning this from watching the birds. So yes, to actually understand better about these birds, I had imagined I was a bird. And that's what I do with fiction. I imagine I am the character. So I had a lot of practice doing that. And I think the birds appreciated it because I did things that were within their safety zone, within their sense of security.
I love though that I've heard you refer to the way you put the journal together, that you are an unreliable narrator though, because you're giving
Yeah.
you're not really speaking as the bird. You don't know what exactly they're saying, but I love
Yeah.
the way you made that connection, because that is what some writers
Yeah.
do as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I try not to be an unreliable narrator in my fiction, but you have to understand that I never thought this was going to be published. This was for me. And you can break all kinds of rules that are that you might have for writing serious fiction. But this was my own journal. It was a private journal. The cartoons were just for me. I could be as silly as I wanted to be. Um, and and so, yes, what leads to silliness and something for yourself is you write captions for what you think these birds are thinking or saying. Um, I don't think that I was too far off in what the bird's state of caution might have been or its state of curiosity. I knew, for example, that corvids are very superstitious about anything new. They are neophobic, and that means if you put something down that they don't is not familiar, they will approach it with caution. And sometimes ravens will jump up in the air, do these jumping jacks in front of something new. So I would come with that understanding that of corvids, that they might be suspicious of anything new, like a fake dead crow hanging upside down in my yard.
That drawing that was great.
I would never hurt another creature, bird or rat or anything, but I would have to think in the mind of those creatures that what would make them cautious and stay away. So that was the one thing I learned. Even though I love crows and ravens, they were dominating the feeders and not allowing the other birds in. When they started training their young to raid the feeders, that's when I decided, nah, I'm not going to have a family of crows here because I'm interested in all the birds. So they're in the tree, which I can see. They're right close by. They love the oak trees, and they're right there. They still come. They just can't get to the feeders.
Do you find that you have, when you look at the birds and you think about what, they may be feeling and you be the bird, how does it relate to you? Like, how does it make you reflect about your own existence in
Yeah.
nature?
It has to do with survival, and it made me think about compassion as well. I wrote about in one entry about morality and how it reflects not just about survival, but morality that is part of survival. I mean, if our morality is simply going to be one, that I have to take care of myself first, then if I find a cache of food, I'm going to keep it for myself. I'm not going to share with that child who's starving over there. I'd have no compassion. But I would see with birds the kinds of things that they would do and try to see if there was an equivalent in morality or emotion. There is no, one-to-one, of course, in any of that. And I had to think also, what are the instincts of bird that I lack? They are programmed, so to speak, to fly away with sudden movements. They are they tend to be predictable in coming to the feeders before it rains. What do I do? Well, when we heard there was going to be a shutdown, didn't we all go to the store and stock up on toilet paper and, food that we would never eat, cans of food we'd never eat? Kind of a similar thing. I was very delighted to find out from an ornithologist recently that birds do have emotions that are signaled by changes in their hormonal levels. So it'd be like changes in cortisol and the kinds of things you would equate to dopamine, serotonin. And that's what happens to us when we're anxious, when we're scared, when we're stressed, we get higher cortisol levels. So that was interesting to learn that they do in fact have emotions, and I think it's good for people to recognize that, especially among people who think that birds are just dispensable, disposable things in our life. That they don't care that birds are disappearing and that we actually need to save them. And I would love for people to recognize all the similarities in human beings, that we all deserve to live and pass on to the next generation all that's wonderful about us, and along with some things that are not so great, but that the continuation of life requires us to live together. It's been an eye-opener for me to see how smart birds are and how much we have not bothered, or I have not bothered to understand those qualities in birds. And it makes me think I need to understand that in all living creatures. The part about intelligence too makes me wonder what else birds know. They are, after all, descended from dinosaurs, and dinosaurs lived for much longer than we have, so that they had a kind of animal intelligence that was good for survival. And some of that is built into them about being able to thermoregulate in a certain way, for example, but that there are lots of things we could learn from animals as well.
There's a lot of things we can learn, and be kind to animals, be kind to birds, be kind to humans. I think those are really good lessons for everyone. Um,
Yeah.
I want to end on this by saying that a lot of people, when you say, I'm a bird watcher, and I've gotten this stat from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. There are 96 million people out there who say they are bird watchers, but that doesn't mean 96 million people are scientists or even know the name of the bird that's like sitting out on the tree right now. It's just watching them and enjoying them and being curious. And so,
isn't that great?
I think you got to do it.
I think it's so wonderful.
Yeah,
they're out there. They're out there, and I would. My biggest wish is that people who love birds get more involved with birds and are so in love with them that they want to help somehow in bird conservation. It's a fun thing to do. I will say I am a bird watcher more than I am a birder. I will go out with friends and go birding. And what is a turnoff for a lot of people is that a lot of this birding behavior is considered to be elitist, that people go out with their lists and they have to see 300 birds if they're going to feel satisfied going to Ecuador, for example. Whereas I can be happy with one bird in my yard and watching that same bird over and over again. As you said, don't need to know the name of the bird, don't need to do anything, just watch and enjoy and receive a lot of discoveries, discover something new about yourself, and it's all worthwhile.
And on those words, I thank you very much, Amy, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's my interview with author Amy Tan. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. Thanks for listening.